Other one. Right. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this joint Overview and Scrutiny Committee meeting. I'm Councillor Alistair McCraw, and I'm chairing the meeting today. Apologies for the late departure of this service. The late arrival of this service, but I'm afraid the trains are running as normal, as in late. First of all, can I remind you of some domestic arrangements? Please ensure that you maintain social distance from all other persons in the chamber and in the social areas. Please ensure that you wear a mask unless you are speaking or if you are unable to do so, and that you use the hand sanitizer and wipes provided. Please maintain social distance at all times during the meeting and during any breaks, and ensure that microphones are turned off when not in use, that you do not interrupt other speakers, that if you are attending the meeting to speak and persistently interrupt the meeting, you may be asked to leave. Please ensure your mobile phones are on silent or switched off. Additionally, we will be using the Modern Gov app for e-voting this meeting. I'd like to remind everyone present that this meeting will be broadcast live to the internet and will be capable of repeated viewing. The whole of the meeting will be filmed, except where there are confidential or exempt items. If you make a representation to the meeting, you will be deemed by the Council to have consented to being filmed, and by entering this meeting as a speaker, you're also consenting to be recorded by the Council and to the possible use of those images and sound recordings for webcasting and or training purposes. The Council, members of the public and the press may record, film, photograph or broadcast this meeting when the public and press are not lawfully excluded. Before we get started, just say it's very nice to see everybody face to face again. And it's been a very strange year, all right, mostly face to face. At least we can see the colour of our eyes and we don't have to look at a little series of boxes and then move around. So that is a great pleasure, and it is really nice to see everybody again. Hopefully we'll see how that works for the productivity of the meeting. So can I move now to the agenda? Apologies for absence and substitutions. Henriette?
Thank you, Chair. We have received apologies from Councillor Gould.
Thank you very much. And declarations of pecuniary and non-pecuniary interests. Are there any such to declare? No such. Good. Item 3, JOS 2020, confirmation of the minutes of the meeting of the Joint Overview and Scrutiny Committee held on the 22nd of March 2021. Are there any points regarding the accuracy of those minutes? If there are none, can I have a proposal that those minutes be accepted? Thank you, Councillor Muller, and seconded by Councillor Osborne. Governance Officer will now conduct the electronic vote, which will be on, if I can find it, on the voting in Modern Gov. Now highlighted in blue, for, against or abstain, and then you confirm.
Councillor Miller?
For.
Do we have the results of the vote?
Yes, Chair, that's 10-4. That doesn't add up with me.
Sorry, 10-4.
10 votes for. We are more than that.
There are 10 of us. Are there not?
Yes,
that's
we
fine.
are.
Sorry, yes, it's unanimous. That's great, thank you. Sorry, I thought you sounded a little bit uncertain about it. I thought we were going to do the Eurovision all over again. So the minutes of the meeting of the 22nd of March 2021 have been confirmed and will be signed at the next practicable opportunity, which I would imagine Councillor Wellham and myself will be doing quite a bit of signing of minutes for the previous year after this meeting, will we not?
That's correct, Chair.
Yes, so that'll be a session. Item 4, to receive notifications of petitions in accordance with the Council's petition scheme. Are there any to report?
None received, Chair.
None received. Item 5, questions by the public.
None received, Chair.
And item 6. Yes, it is 6. Questions by councillors.
None received, Chair.
None received. And then finally, we come to the substantive item of today's meeting, which is a sort of self-generated report. So I'm just going to run through this, which is our review of the Overview and Scrutiny Committee in the year 2020 to 2021, the year just passed. Now, you have before you, I believe, the Overview and Scrutiny report for that year as a guidance. There are also some suggested notes as to the themes whereby we could carry out this review. That's one method. Quite open to any changes. Members can take this any which way they like, because it's been a very peculiar year, and some of the lessons we may have learnt this year may not be applicable in future, but then again, they may. So I think we have to be aware of those possibilities, since everything could be said to be still in some flux. So we are looking basically at the topics we've covered this year in all of our Overview and Scrutiny Committees, whether they be joint or separate, what worked, why, what didn't work and why, what lessons we would learn, what recommendations this joint committee would make to any future ONS committees for Babergh or Mid-Suffolk district councils, and we'll try and see if we can come to a summary at the end. I'm just going to kick something off right away, because I think it's a good place to have a starting point, that we were operating last year under the conditions of lockdown remotely, and it's an elephant in the room, it has to be addressed. What lessons would we learn that were good about remote meetings? What were bad about remote meetings? And are there any aspects of remote meetings that we would wish to continue using? I just throw that out open as a start, because I think we should get it out of the way, and then we can get to the substantive business of actually carrying out scrutiny. Over to you, members. Yes, certainly, Councillor Grandon.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just clarify, do you mean in relation to overview and scrutiny, or the council altogether?
I was thinking in particular of the practicalities of carrying out a scrutiny function using remote meetings specifically, but obviously there are some general points that would apply to all meetings. So I think it's open to you, effectively. This is just a starting point I'm suggesting. You're welcome to go elsewhere, by the way.
Thank you, Chair. I must admit, bearing in mind the circumstances we had in the last year, I thought the online meetings worked extremely well. Obviously, it's nice to be back face to face, but yes, I was quite happy with what happened and how we went about the work during the year. So thank you, Chair.
Councillor Whelan and then Councillor Whelan.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I agree with what Councillor Muller has said. The one thing that I think is missing when we are on Zoom is the sort of interaction and the informal meeting beforehand and so on. I think we miss that, and I don't think that can be replicated on Zoom. But I think it went quite well. Of course, there were one or two teething problems with some people who dipped in and out of broadband. I don't know whether it's possible to do anything about that. I think one of the things that I found was that the pressures on staff, there were more pressures on staff as a result of the way that we were operating. So I really felt, at times I really felt for staff who were having to be online with perhaps their pets or children around. I think they did extremely well, but there were occasions when I think one or two felt a little bit embarrassed because a dog barked or somebody came to the door and so on. But all in all, I think everyone did really well. But it's really good to be back seeing people. and you know, just chatting with people for a few minutes beforehand, albeit socially distanced, I think it helps in the sort of running of the meeting if we've met informally just beforehand. Thank you, Chair.
Just to add to that, since my co-chair has just spoken, I think, did you find I found chairing those meetings the most challenging chairmanship I've ever had to undertake. I don't know if you felt the same way, but it was hard work at times, just to keep control and track of everything with multiple screens, which were necessary. And, you know, you lose that ability to have everything in front of you and you can't turn your face. Okay, so Councillor McLaren and then Councillor Grandin.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to say thank you to everybody, and that's officers and our committees, joint committees. I actually thought we did extremely well. Certainly for Babergh, we had slightly different challenges during the year that Mid-Suffolk didn't have, where we had additional meetings, but I think they were undertaken properly within the procedure. And I think it's all credit to everybody, especially the officers. I think they supported us very well, and the advice we got from Emily was amazing in some of the hurdles that we had to overcome during the year. So I just want to say thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much. Councillor Grandin.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I'd like to reiterate what Councillor McLaren said. I think we had a lot of help and support from officers, and I think it did work as well as it could. I certainly found it quite stressful at the beginning when from a technical point of view, and I think all of us had to learn how to deal with this new way of working. And you know, how lovely it was just now. I just stuck my finger in the air and caught your eye, and that was it. And you know, you almost can't beat that in a meeting room. And you know, again, I think you in this room here today, we've got that mix of the formal and the informal. There is no atmosphere on an online meeting. And you know, it's lovely to be back in person again, and I think our meetings will, while they were functionary before, I think they will improve by being in person again. Although I think, while meetings in general, not necessarily ONS, going forward, it might be a good idea to have a hybrid option where possible, and if the House of Parliament can do it, I don't know why we can't, but you know, I think that would be a nice option for those for whom it would be more practical. But I'm pleased to be back, but thought it worked quite well once I got over all my technical problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Grandin. As I understand it, there are legislation would be required to ensure or to allow hybrid meetings. That's going to be dealt with at Westminster. Obviously, we may well have input from the council on that subject. I believe that's already underway, isn't it, Emily? Thank you. Yes, Councillor Caston.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I can relate to what you're saying about the workload of the chair, because the workload for the councillors in the meeting. I had my first meeting in person last Monday, audit and standards, and I noticed when I got in that room how much the workload was reduced sitting there. I think one thing on the Monday meetings, Monday mornings seem to be a very busy time for broadband, and there's quite a lot of lag with the papers, and sometimes you were trying to look on a paper for what someone was talking about and you couldn't find it before they'd finished talking. But I think it is a massive step forward, and the fantastic thing about it is that we've proved that we can do it in a time when we've been forced to do it, and it would have been very hard to make that shift in normal times. In normal times it would have been a huge step, it took the pressure off, I think, being forced to do those remote meetings. But yeah, I think there's definitely a future in it somehow. The hybrid meeting seems to me like a really good way of reducing the carbon footprint of the council, reducing travel time and all that, and to give people a choice. But we have to wait to see whether we're allowed to, and that will be the interesting thing going forward, whether we're allowed to carry on beyond COVID. Thank you.
There were some positives, obviously. Councillor Carter.
Got a button right eventually. There we go. Well, I think Teams meetings have been really, the accidents and the mishaps have been a blessing in disguise for the council in general. It's proving that we are people, and even in a time of crisis, when you have the noise of a dog in the background, when you have a child in the background interference, it actually brings the humanity back into the meetings. You can put politics aside, you can put the meeting aside, just remember that we are all trying to live, trying to interact in the meeting at a time of crisis, and we're doing a blinking good job of it. You know, it was made harder, and it was proved to be harder for officers, but it did bring an appreciation to it that we might not have had previously. So I think it's been really good to have those meetings. It's also been made, the technological advances that we had to make due to it, the in-app voting, which it's been a blessing. It might not always be possible to get might not be possible for me to raise my hand, for instance, or to get people somebody's catch your eye or something like that. So if we had something as well that I could click and notify you that I want to speak, wonderful if we can do that as a hybrid. It makes it more accessible. And if we could have these hybrid meetings where not just councillors could possibly not be able to attend, but actually attend virtually, but if we had speakers attending virtually to some meetings, that would open up, it would make it more accessible, make it more remote, but more personal. So I think that if we could make a statement to the government saying how, even if it's not just a council or just scrutiny, saying that these remote meetings, these hybrid meetings, are proving to be not just beneficial, but could be crucial to how the council should be run, then I think that's what we should be doing. So
It could well bring better accountability in democracy. Members of the public can access and be engaged in the meetings to a greater extent. I have quite a list of speakers now. I don't have to look for whose hand went up first anymore, but I'm just going for it. So, Councillor Osborne, did you raise your hand, or was I misreading that? No, you weren't. It's okay. Councillor Grandon, then. That's okay. I must have just picked up on the wrong visual cue. My apologies. Oh, you did, Councillor Eppingham. I've got you after Councillor Grandon, though. So I had her first. Councillor Grandon.
Thank you, Chair. A point was raised earlier about Monday morning meetings, and I did find, and I think others did, that because our overview and scrutiny meetings are on Monday morning, that everyone else's meetings seem to be on Monday morning, and there was an issue with broadband. Certainly I found that, and I think others did too. I wonder if we're in the unfortunate position of having to work from home again in the way that we had, whether it should be considered that Monday morning meetings should, at that time, be moved to another day or time. Is that something we should consider, perhaps?
It's certainly something we can consider. I think some of it has been because of, well, in past room requirements, and then practice, and then officer requirements, and so on. And
but if it was diarised as, you know, we would hopefully not be thrown immediately into a crisis position, but if it was known that if we were put into that position, any meetings on a Monday morning would would be moved to another time, would you think that would work? What is the...
It's how long is a piece of string question every time we discuss, you know, the times we meet. In previous years, I recall we've had suggestions of meetings at differing times. Some prefer afternoons, some prefer mornings. Those who've got working jobs find that sometimes are not convenient for them.
Sorry, I was thinking more from a broadband point of view rather than a convenience point of view.
Okay, yeah, good point. We can certainly look at that. I think it's actually still comes down to officer time, of course, and availability of resources there. I had Councillor Epinyon next.
Thank you, Chair. I agree with what other councillors have said about the conduct of these meetings over the past year and a bit, and I think the officers are to be commended for the way in which they've allowed us to keep our work going, both in terms of their personal effort and the technology moving us, I think, relatively seamlessly from face-to-face meetings to online meetings. I would strongly suggest that we do indeed explore the option of having hybrid meetings, because there are some meetings where effectively we're not really discussing matters of import, but we're looking at what's been happening or what, you know, looking at agendas going forward. So there are some meetings, I believe, that could be quite happily held online. And so we should definitely be pressing for that. I mean, it's a way of working that is very prevalent now in private industry and works extremely well, and is for the good reasons that other councillors have mentioned in terms of efficiency of the time and not travelling and so forth. I think the other thing that as a council we need to put a lot of effort into is pressing by whatever channels really the proper rollout of broadband in Suffolk, because I think if this is going to be the way that we're going to do things in the future, and I certainly think so, then we need to have ubiquitous broadband all around. And it's not only just for us to have meetings that, you know, we don't have disconnections going on and so on and so forth, but I think it will also help to drive the economy of the rural areas in particular, because people then can more happily work from home because they have a reliable connection to use. So that's a couple of points I'd like to make on that.
That's an excellent point. It occurs to me as well that should the committees ever decide they wish to set up some form of task and finish group, a small number of members concentrating on one particular subject, that a Teams meeting would be ideal for that, since no voting would necessarily be required, and it's the voting element that requires our face-to-face presence, if I'm correct in that analysis. Councillor Wellham.
Chair, you've said almost exactly what I was going to say. I was going to add a question, and that is, if we did have more task and finish groups, can they actually meet without the public having access to the meeting? Because I'll come on later. I think we've not used task and finish groups this year, but there may be for all sorts of reasons, but that may be the way forward. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor Wellham. I think that moves us on quite conveniently to another theme that might be developing. Emily, did you want to add something on this point?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I just wondered if it would be helpful for members for me to just outline the framework of the High Court decision that ruled that the meetings had to return to in-person. That only applies to formal decision-making meetings of either the Council, the Cabinet or the committees. So anything like a task and finish group or an informal meeting with officers can still be held virtually. Also councillor briefings, training, that kind of thing. Following the initial High Court ruling, there was a follow-up question which was around how is a meeting in public defined, and the High Court said that to be held in public, that meant that members of the public also had to be able to attend in person, which is why we can't just rely on the live stream. So all of our meetings are being live streamed, which means members of the public have the option to view them. But to be truly in public, you have to have provision for members of the public to attend in person. That part of the ruling also stated that active participants in the meeting also had to be able to attend in person, which has kind of prevented the notion of a hybrid meeting that we've been discussing in kind of preparation for returning to in-person meetings, where we thought that speakers or officers could perhaps join virtually. Unfortunately, that's not possible, because if you are intending to participate in the meeting, you have to be in the meeting room as well. So a change to that does require an amendment to primary legislation. We are lobbying through our professional organisations and through the local government association to push that forward, but it's anybody's guess how quickly that legislation would come forward in terms of the demands on the parliamentary timetable. So hopefully that was just a useful summary, Chair.
That's very useful, thank you, Emily. Councillor Carter, you wanted to follow up on that?
Yes, it's just an interesting point on how members of the public have to be able to attend a person. We are one of, well, the only council that I know of that actually holds our meetings outside of our boundaries, outside of the constituency. So for members of the public to attend our meetings, actually it's more difficult, less accessible for them to get to actually attend a meeting in person than it would be online. Whereas if we do have offices that are used, we have public-facing points, access buildings, would it not be possible to set up remote links to these buildings in constituencies, in the areas, such as in Stonemarket and Sudbury, places like that, for members of the public to attend their local office and attend a meeting, sit down in front of a camera, and wouldn't that count as an in-person meeting?
It
Make
could,
it more
could
accessible,
well be
certainly.
possible. I think, as Emily's pointed out, it's a question of what's legal at the moment, but it may well be possible, and I think it's something that's under active consideration. Rather than dwell too long on the pluses and minuses of remote meetings, internet, and Teams, and all the rest of it, there's one point I'd just like to members to consider as to whether the use of remote meetings affected the quality of the work and the breadth of the work that Overview and Scrutiny were able to carry out in the course of the last year. I think it's a fair question and it should be asked. So, Councillor Carter, that's okay. Any thoughts on that? Yes, Councillor Carter, please.
One thing I do miss from remote meetings is the ability to mute myself when I'm having a spasm attack. So that might make meetings a bit quicker and less interrupted.
Fair point. And then Councillor McLaren.
Thank you, Chair. Interesting the comments being made about wanting online meetings, and in some ways I think we're reflecting the fact that we've come out of a very long period of something that was stable, different but stable, and I think we are showing some reluctance, I think, to come back to probably what we had before. I personally am glad to be back, and I think the benefit of interaction with my colleagues of all parties, I missed that, and I also felt that you didn't get a sense over a camera of people's actual body language and how it was being said, and I think that is part of the skill of being sat in a meeting like this. And I certainly perhaps some hybrid meetings, but I'm just glad to be back in a real world. Thank you.
You miss the humanity, don't you? I think it is the visual and verbal, non-verbal clues and all the rest of it. Councillor Grandon.
Thank you, Chair. I sometimes, I like being able to volunteer to join in the meeting as I'm doing right now. On an online meeting, it becomes much more formalised, and sometimes I felt forced to say something when actually I didn't have anything that I wished to say, because we were going round in an order, or someone had already said it and so I didn't really feel that I had anything to say. Whereas now I can volunteer to participate. Just at the moment, I wish to participate, not because we're in the rotation of being asked, so that everyone can get a fair go. So I'm finding that I feel more comfortable in participating in an open room situation. Thank you.
Any thoughts on the effect remote meetings may have had on the quality and breadth of the work that we undertook in that time? Councillor Scarf and then Councillor Wellham.
Thank you, Chair. What I was going to say, actually, I think remote meetings, particularly large meetings, if you look at council, for example, they were very lengthy meetings, partly because of the technology, because we had problems with the voting app to start off with, and could we get the broadband width and so on. But I think sometimes members were inhibited, perhaps, from making the contribution that they might have made because they were conscious of the time running away in meetings. I don't think that affected the work of the Overview and Scrutiny Committee quite so much because it's a smaller committee, but certainly the larger meetings, I think members felt perhaps, well, I won't make a contribution because we've taken so long, and some of those meetings could take 3 or even 4 hours. I wondered if we could move on to the what worked and why bit, because I had some particular observations, if you'll allow me. From my experience, I think the use of witnesses worked really well, and I think that's something that worked well whether we were online or not. For example, our review of the Citizens Advice Bureau, I think that was an excellent meeting. We had really good quality information provided by the witnesses, and we were able to grill the witnesses, if you like, for their views on the workings of the council and so on, and perhaps to a lesser extent the outside bodies, because it was mainly members of the 2 joint committees who were the witnesses, so we were sort of witnesses to ourselves, which was not quite so good. From a Vice Chair's point of view, I thought the briefings and officers' report preparation via remote meetings worked very well, and obviously that's something I would expect we would carry on doing, because even though it's quite easy to get here for me by train, it adds another hour onto the day in terms of the meeting time, so I thought that worked really well. I thought in terms of the quality of reports, we were obviously slightly handicapped by the fact that officers were dealing with many issues outside of the meeting. We weren't the only thing that was important in their mind, and they were dealing, with that. But I thought overall the quality of the reports was good, and the major reports was good. I don't think we suffered too much by having to operate under the pandemic situations. I think, that they were good. And in terms of adding value, finally, I think we added value where we could, although with some of the issues it's extremely difficult to add much value because it's more or less a review of something which is a foregone conclusion. But where we did add value, I think that was useful. So they were my points on what worked and why. Thank you.
Very useful. Thank you, Councillor Scarf, and I'm glad we're moving on to the other themes. I think it's highly likely that chairs' meetings, chairs' briefings for all committees might find themselves being conducted online. That would make sense. Dragging oneself, okay, not dragging perhaps, but having to make one's way to Endeavour House for 4 or 5 people to meet just doesn't make sense, particularly when we've all got busy lives. So that might well be future practice across the council as a whole. Any other themes from the list in front of you? Councillor Wellham, you had something.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I agree with everything that Councillor Scarf has said. There's just one thing from a personal point of view that I have missed in terms of interaction with officers in my role as chair. I'm one of the people who quite often would come into Endeavour House. I didn't feel, okay, it took an hour out of the day, but and I would quite often meet with officers I had not planned necessarily to meet. And if they were officers who were in a preparation stage of a report, we would quite often have a bit of a dialogue. And I missed that, but having said that, I think that each of us who wants to have that dialogue needs to find a way to have that, because we're not going to come back to a stage where you can just bump into the planning officer or whoever just by having a cup of coffee on the outside of the office. So I think we've got to find a way to perhaps have more one-to-ones, or perhaps the chairs and the planning officer if it's a planning report, or communities officer if it's a communities report, or just to not wait until we've got the set meeting when we're going to expect the draft report, but for us to have a bit of interaction with the authors before we reach that point.
You mean the happy accidents that
Yeah.
yes, you accidentally bump into somebody and in fact it results in you moving things forward.
So I think that's something that we've got to plan the unplanned meeting, I think. The other thing about the year that we've had is that we've been guided almost entirely by the needs of Cabinet and Council. Most of the issues that we've scrutinised have been those which we've been asked to do, and I think we've got to be braver, and we've got to set our own agenda. And in order to do that, perhaps a lot of the background work on some of these items which we have to do year by year, perhaps we could look at a task group doing the background work, so that we don't spend so much time going through, tables and sums and percentages and so on. And if I can just carry on with something slightly different, I've got a feeling that, I enjoy joint meetings because there's more of us, so we get a much broader discussion. But joint meetings mean there are fewer meetings, which in one way is a good thing, but it also means that there are fewer issues scrutinised, because we try to match our agendas. It may well be that we should be looking at not having so many joint meetings, but for Mid-Suffolk members to scrutinise Mid-Suffolk issues, and similarly Babergh.
I think you're absolutely correct, Councillor Wellham. I think last year was very much circumstance driven, not just the COVID-19, but the fact that the officer time, because of that and other things, meant that effectively our agenda was largely set by those circumstances and the physical realities, and hence the extra meetings. We held actually a lot of meetings. I mean, there were periods where scrutiny was amongst the hardest working committees on the council. I think that's fair to say. And looking at the reports which will be presented to both councils this week, you can see that we actually got through pretty much most of what we planned, given the circumstances. That in itself is remarkable. Councillor Carter.
I was wondering if it'd be possible for us to ask the officers in attendance what it has been like. We were talking about the happy accidents of meeting them. Well, I, for one, I'm sure other councillors have, turned to teams to actually contact the officers more and speak to the officers more. I rarely came in unless it was for a meeting. I didn't have those accidents, but I've actually spoken more in the past year to the majority of the officers than I have the whole time of being a councillor. I've enjoyed reaching out. I've enjoyed having a joke occasional on teams. I've quite possibly irritated more officers in the past year than I have in my time being as a councillor. But I did wonder, how has it been like for councillors to reach out, send you a message on Teams, to receive an email from us? Has it been more of a hindrance, or has it been beneficial to have the unhappy accidents via intentional mishaps, as it were?
I think that's an excellent point you make there. Let's ask the officers for their reflections on practice and how this, all those points. But just let's try and ask the officers if they're happy to give us their perspective on the way that ONS in particular, or perhaps some other generalisations. And I would open this to any of the officers here present, and I mean every single one of you. Feel free to throw whatever you have into the ring.
Come on, be brave.
I can see Emily's chomping at the bit.
Thank you, Chair. And of course, if any other officers want to join in, then please do. So I would reflect the feedback that members have given about the informal interactions and missing those. So there has been less opportunity for just catching up with a councillor in the corridor, just having those very quick conversations, but also that more personal side of those conversations as well, and particularly I think the kind of welfare conversations that quite often we have when we're in person, you know, just the how are you doing, how are the family, so on and so forth. I do think there's been benefit to the additional contact on Teams or phone calls, and I think probably I've spoken to members who don't have the flexibility of coming into the office during the working day. So particularly those councillors that are in full-time employment, they've been able to have a telephone call quickly during the day, whereas normally they might have been prevented from doing so, or just councillors that their role doesn't bring them into the office as much. So I think I've probably spoken to more members, but less frequently on a kind of individual basis. And certainly I've been very appreciative of members being very flexible about my children appearing in Teams calls and interrupting meetings, and I thank you all for that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Councillor Carter, you wanted to follow up?
Yes, we still haven't arranged a play date for our children, have we yet? There's still time.
There we go. There's a happy accident. Kathy.
Good morning. I obviously in my role tend to meet with a lot of you in various different groups, but one of the things I would say that I've noticed in the last year is that members contact me by a wider range of methods, you know, whether that's chat on Teams or whether it's WhatsApp. Yes, of course, still email and still the odd telephone call, but certainly a greater diversity of means. And one of the things I've really enjoyed is that when members have called me, that we have turned on our cameras, and so rather than just the phone call, that actually we've been virtually face-to-face, which has been great.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask if that irritated officers, because I don't like to impose too often. Any other members, any other officers wish to comment on the way the relationships have gone and can go? Jan.
Ooh, I think it's got a bit of a buzz, but yeah. So I've quite actually, once I've got over the horror of having to do arrange virtual meetings and get councillors on board, I've quite enjoyed them, and I know councillors do miss the interaction with each other, but normally before a meeting we're in there a little bit earlier and we do have some interaction. Teams messages has been really, really useful to me because it's instant, so and councillors have started to use those a lot more. So for me, I can see that actually if I'm in a meeting and people have got issues, they've been able to instant message me. And I know we had Skype before, but with Teams it's a lot easier. So for me, I've really enjoyed the use of Teams. The frustrations I have is when I'm working from home, and this goes back to Councillor Eppington's point, I do sometimes have really slow broadband, and that drives me up the wall when I'm trying to do something or expected to do, a meeting or going into something, and everything just slows down and you have to log off and go back in again to get back in, and I do find that frustrating. But on the whole, I think virtual meetings and the communication around them have been, once we got going and into it, have been really, really good. And for overview and scrutiny, I think it's given it an increased flexibility for calling people in for witnesses. You've been able to do that without actually people having to travel in. So we've been able to get a wider maybe selection of people able to join the meeting. Whereas, if you're asking them to come into Endeavour House, it's a lot more logistically difficult. So for me, that has given us a flexibility that we haven't seen before. So I'm definitely all for it.
Thank you very much, Jan. Actually, I think this question of flexibility is something we're going to return to over and over again, and that we are now aware of more methods of working, more methods of meeting, more methods of doing everything, and that we don't need to be confined and constrained to the practices of the past, because we've discovered there are others. I was going to ask, though, specifically on the preparation of reports and the extra work involved in preparing for meetings. Has that, and I look to Henriette, who has undertaken a great deal of the workload of preparing for our meetings. Do you have any thoughts, Henriette, on whether it has become much harder to prepare for the meetings in the course of the last year? Sorry to put you on the spot.
Not really, I think. I think maybe in some ways it's been easier because we haven't had to print out and organise, dispatch and that sort of thing, which we sort of going away from anyway. So for us as committee officers, it has been easier, I think. Communication has been easier as well because there's no, I mean, in some ways it's been easier, in other ways, I suppose when you worked in here, you really sort of got to desk and talk to people directly. Now you had to call them, but I think overall, I don't think it has made that much difference, really. I think preparation of reports and agendas, it's just a different way of working, and it's just trying to get used to that, I think.
Thanks very much, Henriette. I just wanted to establish that, whether we were actually making things more difficult for officers or not. Right, any of the other themes that members would like to pick up on? I think we're moving forward through them, and some of them have been touched upon. Use of witnesses, the quality of the reports. We've discussed briefly the potential for working groups and committee member involvement, perhaps member responsibility. Time management in meetings is something I'm always a little bit obsessed by, because I'm aware that meetings that go on too long and don't follow a clear direction will end up just going in circles and not actually coming to any forms of conclusion or adding any value. So any thoughts on time management? And similar matters? Well, nobody's rushing forward on that one, all right. So do members understand why we try to operate? I think both Keith and myself have operated in the same basic principle of trying to provide direction to the meeting and shape, but it's members that we need to actually supply the content. You don't want to hear us droning on all the time. Okay, Councillor McLaren.
Thank you, Chair. I think time management, in fact, has been perhaps one of the downsides of actually our virtual meetings. It's very easy when everybody's in a different place. And some, I'm not talking particularly about this committee, but some committees have actually gone on for quite a long time. Now that might be right, but what you lose is the impetus by the committee to come to a conclusion. And I think we should be aware of that. I've not been aware in this committee that we've ever not time managed, or the chairs have not time managed. But it is very off-putting to be in a long-winded committee, and you don't get the best of the councillors' commitment to a resolution. Thank you.
I'm already aware today that in the course of the last hour we've covered more ground than we would have done in a remote meeting. I would estimate this would have taken another half an hour to get this far and to cover this breadth of range of points. That's just an observation from, suddenly realised, yes, we're getting somewhere. Councillor Wellham.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I think the time management of our meetings has gone pretty well, and it's thanks to the officers and to members of the committee that they have. Picking up on Councillor Grandon's point about being asked to speak when they haven't at that point got anything to say, that can be an embarrassment to the chair and to the members of the committee, in that there were a few occasions when I've got my list and the first 5 people haven't had anything to say, and you wonder if anybody's going to say anything. Face to face, we're more likely to get people in a sensible order speaking. But if we are going to have more remote meetings. We need to just find a different way of doing that. Perhaps when we had our face-to-face pre-meetings, we did get 2 or 3 people who would say, well, on that item, I would like to say such and such and such and such. So, you know, would it be beneficial if I spoke first, because it will get the discussion going? Because we haven't had pre-meetings of that sort, we just haven't had that informal discussion immediately prior to the meeting, and I think that would be useful if we could find some way of doing that.
What about the matter of scoping of topics? The practice we used to carry out on a regular basis was scoping, pre-examination of something that we would be looking at in greater detail further down the line. Do we want to... I mean, it was good reasons why we didn't get a lot of scoping done this last year, because we had other priorities changed, shall we say. But I think we obviously have to consider if there are areas we want to scope and how we're going to go about that. Or, as some members suggested to me, they found that scoping was just repeating ourselves, that we were quite capable of going straight into the subject and examining it with one report, rather than, as it were, doing it twice. There's 2 viewpoints to consider there. Either one of those might be valid. Any thoughts on that? Councillor Grandin.
Thank you, Chair. I would say the idea of scoping is a good idea, but it should be short and sharp. You know, maybe not time limit it, but be aware that this isn't a big discussion. It's just to get to a point, and it's not the meeting in itself. So if we kind of set ourselves parameters, this is not the whole discussion. We're only going to look at this, you know, who are we going to get to speak, or what are our parameters, and limit it, and maybe not actually time limit it physically by saying this only lasts 10 minutes or 15 minutes or whatever, but have in our minds that this should be a short, sharp thing and it's not the meeting in itself. Whereas I think we sometimes forgot that previously. So that's maybe just a different approach to it.
I quite understand. So providing a focus for scoping before, rather than trying to do it all in one go. Councillor Caston.
Thank you very much. I think the chairing of our overview and scrutiny meetings has been excellent, and we could have easily found that meetings went on a lot longer and didn't find direction without 2 very good chairs looking after it. The scoping side of things, the pre-meeting and scoping, I don't see that much difference between the 2. I think that pre-meeting is quite crucial, because you can know a report off by heart, you can know every single word in it, but until you go into the pre-meeting and that gets churned about and people start opening up different avenues and things like that, that's when you really start getting deeply into the content of a report. So I think I'll be pleased to see the pre-meeting back. I think that helps me quite a lot with these meetings, with direction. But yeah, the scoping side of things, I do feel that we're doing the same thing twice a little bit, and I don't feel it's as necessary maybe as other councillors, but yeah, but that pre-meeting to me is a really important part of this process.
Saw quite a few nods on this discussion of pre-meetings, and obviously it's something I've always been in favour of, because I think preparation pays off. That half an hour or quarter of an hour can actually save you a great deal more time further into the meeting. Do I get the impression from members that they would like to see pre-meetings being adopted as a standard procedure? Cathy, do you have a point on this?
Pre-meetings have been much welcomed by officers, and they have found it very helpful in terms of understanding what scrutiny wants to achieve. But in terms of the scoping, I would say that if we get the right background and the right data in the scoping information that we bring to you, that is key in assisting you to look at what are the key issues that you really need to get your teeth into when you look at the substantive item. So that would be my suggestion.
So scoping as a method of producing a targeted report.
Indeed.
And in fact, effectively, that's what the scoping is there for. It's not to do the report itself, it is to prepare the ground and the areas that the committee wishes to follow up on. Because I have to confess to you all that as chairs, that the four of us get together, or either face-to-face or remotely, and in some ways, we are effectively carrying out a scoping process in those chairs' meetings. But frankly, that is a process that should be shared amongst all the members of the committee, not just the chairs and the vice chairs. All right, that's four of us, and that's, well, it's a significant proportion of the committees. It's about a third, in fact, of the two committees. Even so, there's a lot more people with a lot more input. So I think that's something that we could consider as a recommendation. Yes, Emily.
Thank you, Chair. If I can just add to some of the comments made by the Strategic Director around the benefits of the scoping document from an officer perspective, I think it does a number of really useful things. It enables officers to really understand the nature of the scrutiny that the committee wants to undertake. So what information do you want presented? How can we provide you those assurances where it's an assurance piece of work? And what are the data sets, and who are the witnesses who would really add to the benefits of that scrutiny exercise? The other thing that scoping does is it enables the committee to identify the value add. So you really test that topic. Is it going to add value to that issue by the committee looking at it? So it really enables you to kind of narrow down. Perhaps, you know, you start off with at the start of the year with a multitude of topics that you might want to look into, and that scoping exercise really helps you to then funnel down and pick those topics that will really make a difference to the operation of the council. So I do think it's really helpful, Chair, and I think perhaps where we've come unstuck before when we've used the scoping document is where we've presented you with a blank document, and we've tried to, in committee, actually fill that scoping document in. And so something that I would like to take forward, Chair, is that actually we come to you with an officer-prepared scoping document, and then it's for the committee to test that and to see if there's anything that you want to add or remove from that scoping exercise. And I think, Chair, that will make the exercise less repetitive, and also perhaps the committee will feel less constrained by the scoping exercise itself. Thank you, Chair.
I think what we're looking for as a committee today is basically establishing our own ideas on what best practice should be. And it's up to us to decide what that best practice should be and then to carry it out. So obviously, if we're going to be doing it, we need to need to put our own ideas into that. Thanks very much for that, Emily. Councillor McLaren.
Thank you, Chair. I think this highlights one of the items that I was going to bring up anyway, which is about training of the committee. So I think we mentioned a lot of activities, the committee changes, people change, and I think there would be some benefit in going through some of these things in a training situation so that councillors coming onto the committee understand what it is perhaps they're trying to achieve. I think it's as basic as that, to be honest.
Some of the most effective training we've ever held on scrutiny in the course of the last 4 years has actually been face-to-face. I wouldn't call them away days, but they have been useful to go somewhere else and to tackle a topic or tackle a subject, and that might be something that can be brought back in now that we have potential for freedom. Councillor Carter.
We have to admit, feeling rather disadvantaged. I've only ever done scrutiny on Teams. I started just before the COVID struck. I would feel face-to-face very beneficial, and doing some more training very beneficial. Terms like scoping and pre-meetings I've not really experienced. I've never done that. So I've only known Teams, I've only known the benefits to that, I've known some of the disadvantages to that. I'd be interested to see the other side of the story.
There is some excellent material from what was known as the Centre for Public Scrutiny, and I believe has now been renamed to Centre for Scrutiny and Governance. Governance and Scrutiny. Governance. Okay. there is an organisation that does produce. I mean, in fact, it might be worth pulling those some of the basic documents about scrutiny out again. I have a folder full of them. I must confess, I haven't looked at them a little bit in the recent year, but they are there, and they do establish some of the ideas. In fact, they could be. I would just suggest that some of those central ones. I've got a list of them, the basic ones that I think could be distributed to all the members of any scrutiny committee as a matter of course. That would be my suggestion only, though. Okay. I don't see any harm in it, and obviously there are other links, but these are actual fundamental, basic, central guides to the scrutiny process. And, you know, they're not long. That's the big advantage then, not long. Okay, anything else from anybody, please? Because I've lost my screen. Can't see my crib sheet. I'm hoping somebody's got their crib sheet handy for the various topics.
Chair, if I could just briefly say a little bit about the time management while you're looking for your document. I think a lot of the credit for the time management of the meeting should go to Henriette, who did prepare a crib sheet for the chairs for every meeting, and that was a really big help. So big thank you, Henriette, for that.
Yes, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. I mean, basically the preparation, and let's be honest about it, in the online meetings, because see, normally you can share this stuff and you can just go through the agenda and you know the form of words to use. But for the remote meetings, and that sometimes because it's had to be very structured, a script has been necessary, and it has made life a lot easier. So if I sound incredibly glib, it's not me, it's Henriette's writing. But effectively, it does make life possible, I think, is the biggest word. Otherwise, it would take longer. And it's terrible if you find you've forgotten something towards the end of a meeting and a recommendation hasn't been put, and you have to come back to it at a later point. You know, stuff like that. It can happen. So thanks very much to Henriette. Okay, I've got this list back up again. What about recommendations that the scrutiny committees make to Cabinet, to Council, and indeed to officers? How do members feel that we have dealt with making our recommendations and ensuring they've been followed up on? Councillor Eppingham.
Thank you, Chairman. As a relatively new member to Overview and Scrutiny, one of the very point you're alluding to is one that concerns me. Is I don't see a structured mechanism for getting the feedback that recommendations have been carried through, particularly in a timely fashion. So I think that's something that we need to look at. It's one thing to spend hours scrutinizing something, making recommendations, get them agreed that they should be done. I think much more important, or very important after that, is to understand that A, they have been done, how they've been done, and have we achieved the desired impact of those recommendations. So that's one area that I would be keen to see us address in a more structured way. And I think the issue of scoping for me is in a sense down to the Overview and Scrutiny Committee being cognizant of what the Council is trying to achieve, particularly in particular time period. So, for example, the next municipal year, and how we're driving towards getting those achieved. I noticed that there are some elements of the report where we talk about KPIs, but I certainly, for one, don't recognise that those KPIs have come forward, and what are they, and what are they measuring, and so on and so forth. So this is an area I think that could do with more scrutiny, if I put it that way. So
that's one reason I raised that very point. And the other thing, of course, there are instances where recommendations have been made to, for example, Cabinet, in a matter of pre-scrutinising a Cabinet decision, and then Cabinet have been taken the scrutiny recommendation into account in making their final decision. And at times that has also come back to scrutiny, at least it has in Babergh. And it's obviously a possibility at any time. So that is one where you can actually say, well, this is what has resulted, this is what's then resulted. But there are others that I agree with you are a little more nebulous. We're not entirely certain as to whether this will be taken forward. And I do believe you're right. I think this is something that needs to be tracked, but we need to find a mechanism to do that and to make sure that that mechanism can be followed. It's very easy. You focus, each time you've got the agenda, you focus on the next meeting, your next item. You look at the work plan on a regular basis, but you don't tend to look back on the work plan unless, of course, you're doing the minutes, which is the next time you look back at them, and by which time they may or may not have had a time period in which it's been possible to carry out any recommendation. So, yes, I think that's something that the committee would want to look at. Councillor Wellham.
Thank you, Chair. Following on from what Councillor Epping said about we need to have a look at the actions that are planned by our districts in formulating our plans. That's okay up to a point, but there are a number of issues which are raised by our residents which need to be scrutinised and are not really anything to do with the next year or 2 years. I mean, I just throw out one thing, and I've been asked, why hasn't this Overview and Scrutiny scrutinised rural transport? Because nobody seems to be scrutinising it. It's not something that is directly a responsibility of this authority or our councils, but it is a key issue to a lot of the residents in the rural areas of Babergh and Mid-Suffolk. So at some point I will suggest that, but it's that sort of issue that I think we need to make sure we've got into our work plan, the issues that affect the residents, perhaps not just of our two districts. It might be that it would be a joint scrutiny with other districts as well. But we mustn't close our eyes to those sorts of issues.
I mean, it is quite distinctly, obviously, a matter for the county council on a larger scale, but obviously it affects our residents on the local scale. And it's always been an issue, I think, in local government across the board. How do you cope with some of the matters that are dealt with at different levels? And there can be sort of, I wouldn't say turf war. We have had experience of trying to do joint scrutiny across different councils before. We set up a joint scrutiny task force which involved Babergh, Mid-Suffolk, West Suffolk, Ipswich, sadly not East and Suffolk County Council. That may be something that could be done on the subject of rural transport. And in fact, a joint scrutiny, that's just a suggestion, and I only throw that in. But it's certainly worth, I think it's for the committee to work that out in their next year's plan and the years to come. Any other thoughts? I was going to ask if there was anything that had come out of the annual report that anybody wanted to raise, any thoughts? It just says Chair's reports to Council. It should be, in fact, it's a record of what we did. This is largely prepared by Henrietta, the forward supplied by the two chairs. But obviously we've had sight of it and approved of the content. Did anybody have anything they wish to say before we present that to both councils, annual report? Councillor Epping.
Thank you, Chair. I think there might be a couple of errors we might want to take care of in these reports before we present them to Council.
Do you mean typos?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I mean, the typos I always slip through, I'm afraid. Yeah, I know. I don't know if we can change them now because the papers have been issued. Is that correct, Henriette? Yeah.
That's correct, Chair.
I'm afraid you'll have to blame me and Keith. I did actually spot one grammatical error that I frankly thought, well, if anybody spots that, it just shows that they're paying attention and have read the report. Did you know the Ordnance Survey, whenever it publishes a map, makes a deliberate mistake so that if anybody tries to copy it, the Ordnance Survey can prove that it has been copied. And this is a quite deliberate ploy on the OS. Every single OS map contains a deliberate error. And that's what we're going to call these. Okay, let's see if there's anything else on the topics list, the themes. Does anybody? Henriette? Oh, sorry. Kathy, you wanted to say something. Sorry.
Indeed, Chair. Something that officers have highlighted to me was how they find the benefit of joint scrutiny of particular items where perhaps the decision by one council could have an impact on another. And a good example of that was the joint scrutiny of the insourcing of public realm, where in one world that could have been done just by Babergh, but obviously the impact of insourcing meant that we were entering into a shared service. And so I know that the Assistant Director and Corporate Manager took away some useful pointers from the discussion at scrutiny that would relate to the entirety of the new shared service, and are, will be integrating that into their thinking as they prepare for that later in the year.
Actually, I think recalling that in-house and out-house service, that was a direct benefit in the fact that the two councils had got experience of two different methods of service provision, and we were able to compare and contrast and make a reasoned recommendation on that basis. It was very useful having direct member experience and the two separate councils' experience in coming to the conclusions. So yes, I found that very helpful. Right, members, I see a few more themes that we haven't touched upon, but I don't know that we're going to add a great deal more. Do we want to start thinking about what recommendations we would make, as it were, to this committee as it is in the future? Councillor Eppingham.
Sorry, Chair, I did have another point to raise with regard to the report.
Yes, by all means, sorry.
It relates to the activity of the Western Suffolk Community Safety Partnership. And in the report, it talks about one of the issues being violence against women and girls, men and boys. And I'm just wondering whether in the current climate, we shouldn't actually, that shouldn't just be individuals, rather, or do we actually then need to itemize every kind of gender position?
Well, it's the terminology used in the government legislation that's coming forward. I think there's an act being prepared on that very subject. It came up in the Queen's speech, and it's become the terminology that's been used. Originally, it was violence against women and girls, VAUG, and it was quite rightly pointed out that in a small number of instances, it also existed against men and boys. So it was just extended. We're following, I suppose, in the convention of everybody else in the area. And that's also what I believe the Community Safety Partnership do as well. They're just following in well, I won't call it the fashion of the day, but I will say it's the terminology being used in the field.
I hear what you say, but I still think it needs to be looked at, because there is violence against transgender people, for example. It's well documented. And it just seems to me that this description is a bit restrictive. I
think the trouble with any description is whether how broadly you define it. And I think a lot of people get hung up too much a little bit on definitions when the very principle is quite clear that you don't do this to anybody. But there is a definite, and I don't think it can be argued, there is absolutely no question that the vast majority of domestic violence takes place against women and girls. All the evidence states that, and the white ribbon is there for a reason. Non-tolerance of such behaviour. Councillor Wellham.
Yeah, just to say, Chair, that we were reviewing the action under 5 particular headings or priorities, and that's what the priority is called. So we couldn't call it something different, but we can feed back that this point has been raised.
The Community Safety Partnership also does have a representative for both councils on it. So those many members wanting to raise those points can, of course, raise it directly with the representatives of each council. Councillor Carter.
Just a quick point that violence against men is actually widely underreported. due to there are social cues that men will not come forward. So whilst it is widely reported that the majority of instances are recorded instances of violence against women, there are many reasons why violence against men and also violence against children and boys are not widely reported. So it may be a heading, but it could be against violence in general.
I think it's absolutely definite that violence against women and girls is also equally underreported, and in fact, and this is a known fact and has been for very many years, and is getting increasing recognition. When a subject like this comes up in the Queen's speech, I think you have to recognise that it is actually achieving a much greater degree of political attention than has been the case in the past, and I think that's only to the good, regardless of where it comes from. Okay, I don't want to get bogged down in one small area. It's not a small, it's an important area, but as in terms of the overview of scrutiny and looking at our work, I think you can get stuck in a rut there a little bit. Councillor Carter?
Actually, I'll ask a question out of the meeting. Sorry, I was just going to ask, you mentioned the white ribbon. I wanted to know what the person is for.
It's a campaign that was started a year or so ago, and I think it was brought to the Scrutiny Committee by an officer of the council, although it was not something that could be promoted, but it's non-toleration of violence against women and girls. White ribbon, yeah. Oh, the little person is prostate cancer. Yeah. Black and white, so one for men, one for women, and an equal. Yeah. Right, well, my virtue signalling is over for the moment. Let's move on to see if there's anything else we want to move towards. Any recommendations to the future Overview and Scrutiny Committees? Kathy, sorry.
It was just before you moved on, picking up the point about key performance indicators, that absolutely impact and being able to measure it is key. And you'll recall, those of you who were able to attend the all-member workshops last week, that we are going to be reviewing our performance indicators, but also, as well as that, now that you have the delivery plans, you'll have a suite of things. You'll have the delivery plans, you'll have the quarterly performance reporting, the quarterly finance reporting, and so moving forward, you're going to have a suite of things that actually, will help to bring together and to be able to focus on impact.
I was just going to add on something about member involvement, which occurred to me in terms of the understanding of key performance indicators, is that the cabinet meetings held by both Babergh and Suffolk, and sometimes joint cabinets, often go quite in some depth into key performance indicators in the quarterly reports. And I'd recommend those to any member of any scrutiny committee to keep a track of. We don't do it here. It is done at cabinet, and any member of council can go to any cabinet or watch it obviously online, because it'll be broadcast, so you don't even need to go to the meeting. But the papers and the key KPIs, I think Adrian would agree with me there, that they have also been somewhat improved in terms of the presentation. They are a lot easier to read now because they pick out the key performance indicators as opposed to an exhaustive list in tiny, tiny print, which was useful if you wanted to drill down to that level. But this is a lot easier to use and understand. So, returning then, if I may, to the point about, do we have any recommendations that we would make to future incarnations of Overview and Scrutiny? Councillor Wellen?
Chair, I was just scribbling one or two things which might be helpful. And one of those was to consider for each separate Overview and Scrutiny Committee to consider reducing the number of joint meetings in order to include issues relevant only to their own authority, or perhaps for one of our committees to act as like the lead committee on an issue that affects that district most, but obviously not to exclude the other members of the other committee coming along.
That's a very innovative suggestion. In fact, we could get twice the amount of work covered by using the two committees separately.
Obviously, we'll need to work together to draw up the two plans. Otherwise, we might almost mirror, but not quite. So we'd end up with doing twice as much work for half the benefit. And I think it's worth bringing in the points about having an informal pre-meeting. And also, I think perhaps for the chairs and vice chairs to consider how best to integrate scoping into our agendas.
Well, can we just start with one we can probably agree quite quickly on? Pre-meetings, you see right at the start of the list, that half an hour pre-meeting prior to an Overview and Scrutiny Committee meeting be considered standard practice. Okay, and therefore that we'd meet half an hour beforehand as standard practice. So we could alter that by exception, but standard practice would be. So that would be one possible recommendation. I think I'd be happy to. Well, Councillor Caston was the one who led that off. Would you like to propose that, Councillor Caston?
Yes, please, Mr. Chairman.
Do we have a seconder for that, Councillor Muller? So we have a proposer and a seconder for that one. We'll come back to the votes on these later on, okay? Now, any other recommendations? Councillor Grandon.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just a little bit concerned about Councillor Wenham's matters that he was saying, in that there seem to be quite a lot of things that the two councils do overlap on. And so we could be in a situation where there's a meeting from one scrutiny committee meeting on one council, and then the other council repeats, because I'd say we have more in common than we do different. So while I agree we should have separate committee meetings and keep that, but I would have thought, for me, I would have thought the balance would be more joint ones, but have separate ones, but less often than the joint ones, would have been my view. Whereas, if I understood you correctly, I thought you were saying the opposite. I'm sorry if I misunderstood.
Okay, it's just a matter of definitions. Keith, would you like to elaborate on that?
Well, no, I think I would agree with Councillor Grandon, but perhaps the majority would end up as joint meetings. But I think when we've looked at our work plan, it's tended to be, let's see what we can do jointly, and then with the time left over, we'll do our own thing. I think we ought to, each separate committee should decide what their priorities are, and then see which of those can be brought together as joint scrutiny.
Very clearly some areas where it has to be Mid-Suffolk that deals with Gateway 14. It has to be perhaps Babergh that deals with a parking policy that's being done. It has to be each individual council that, or each individual council's scrutiny committee that is charged with performing that function, questions, etc. Various things that are specific to that council. They actually are less common than the interests we have in shared in common. And there would always be the risk, of course, if we separate too much stuff and both councils look at it separately, or one does and one doesn't, that one council's scrutiny committee may not have come to the same conclusion as the other council's scrutiny committee. And there is a possibility of some problems there, which is where in fact you have, by having a joint overview and scrutiny committee, you avoid that problem. We don't have a split. I think I can recall in 3 or 4 years one occasion where there was a very clear Mid-Suffolk Babergh split, and as it came down to it, it involved the use, the only time I've ever seen it, of the chairman's casting vote. And in fact, I think the matter was resolved afterwards anyway. But that's a rarity, is my point. And I would hope that a scrutiny committee would not be deliberately, accidentally putting itself in a difficult position, and the councils in a difficult position. So we've got the general principle that we will mostly meet as a shared council, but we have to have, and I've always wanted us to have the ability to, and I hope most members to be able to meet on our own if there's something that is of particular interest. Councillor McLaren.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I think we underestimate the value of joint meetings. The very fact that everybody brings different experience in terms of council procedure, in terms of experience of where they've been in the past. And I think the joint meetings do bring together that. You know, with the six members on each scrutiny, you can't embrace all the skill and knowledge that is in a group of 12. And I agree with Councillor Grandon. I think we should make the most of the joint meetings and then specify. And of course in Babergh this year, we've had 1 or 2 meetings that have had to be separate because of situations that have arisen. So that's going to happen anyway.
To that very point, in fact, when I was preparing the report and going through what we dealt with in the course of the year, there were moments where we were very short of members for a Babergh meeting. With a committee composed of 6 people, it became possible for us not to be quorate. When we reduced the number of councillors, we also heavily reduced the number of councillors on scrutiny. And I believe we may have taken the number too low. I believe 6 is possibly at a risk for both councils. And I think this would be a recommendation to make to Emily's department, Jan's department, whatever we want to call it. But fundamentally, I wonder if we should be making a recommendation that the size of the scrutiny committees be increased either to 7 or even 8 members. The risk of becoming inquorate when dealing with matters of one council does exist as we stand. 6 is not many. It doesn't take a lot of absenteeism, and we are restricted to some extent in what the makeup of our members can be, because specific roles are prohibited from being on scrutiny as substitutes. Then there's the group rules that require that a substitute for you can only be from the same political grouping. And I think with only 6 members, we occasionally run at risk of not being able to do a proper job because we aren't actually quorate. So I would ask members what their thoughts are on a recommendation to, which department would it be, Emily? Who should we be making that recommendation to? Cabinet or Council?
Thank you, Chair. It would be a recommendation to the full council because the council is responsible for allocating the committees and the apportionment of places. Of course, that is going to happen this evening for Mid-Suffolk and tomorrow evening for Babergh. So the committee will need to proceed in its current format, at least for the immediate future. What I suggest, Chair, is that officers take away that recommendation to explore increasing the number, and then we can have a look at the makeup and those positions, as you've rightly said, that are excluded from sitting on the committee, and perhaps come up with a recommendation of a sensible number that could be accommodated by the various groups in terms of the membership that
So that recommendation would be for this to be taken away, examined, and then eventually presented to council with some suggested ideas. I'd be happy if does that mean I'm happy to propose that if somebody would second that, Councillor Carter. So we'll do that as a second recommendation, and we'll take the vote on that later. That is, if you've got the wording for that, Henriette, more or less, fine. Okay, and we're looking for concrete recommendations here, but rather than vague things saying, well, we're going to carry on meeting. We're going to carry on meeting in joint session anyway. We can't specify that as a recommendation because it's what we do anyway. Councillor McLaren and then Councillor Caston.
Thank you, Chair. I want to make a recommendation about training. I think we underestimate the value of being able to explore. So many committee members will have a sort of a vague idea of what they're supposed to be doing or not doing, and even making recommendations in itself is a training issue. And I would like to see a more comprehensive training programme for this committee.
Training and making recommendations is a good recommendation to make. Fine. Do you want to add to that, Emily?
I mean, with something comprehensive, I'm not talking about, I certainly attended, I think when I was newly elected, a scrutiny training which was held downstairs, and that included everybody. But I think it needs to be more tailor-made to the situations. I mean, Emily, you know that in our situation in Babergh, we've had 1 or 2 instances where we've all had to learn very quickly about how to handle certain situations. And I've always believed in training for people.
How would you like to phrase the recommendation? I mean, I'm just trying to think about what the Overview and Scrutiny Committee recommends that a training programme be established to work on an annual basis.
Encompassing.
Emily, maybe you can help us on this. Sorry.
Chair, perhaps if I just talk for a little while and then Councillor McLaren can perhaps think about how she might want to word the recommendation, but to just give a slightly wider context. So I absolutely agree that I think a bespoke training session specifically for members of the committee would be really beneficial, and for that to be wider than just the training item that you have on the work plan for the next meeting. So I think we should take that off and hold something separate. I also think that there is scope for holding training for other members outside of scrutiny who are actually coming to scrutiny to present items or to provide feedback. And actually sometimes it's beneficial for the cabinet members to have some training around scrutiny so that they can understand what your function is and therefore how to respond to that item. There are a number of partners we could use for that kind of training, and of course we can do some of that ourselves as well, or support some of that ourselves through in-house officers. Chair, the other thing that might be beneficial alongside that training session is to then have a separate session outside of a formal meeting about developing your work plan and your areas of scrutiny. I'm hearing a number of things, and I think it fits into Councillor Wellham's comments about whether you hold joint scrutinies or separate scrutinies. And part of that is categorising the types of scrutiny that you do. So there's obviously going to be quite an internal focus for scrutiny. You have a clear role in holding the Cabinet to account, scrutinising in an advanced way forthcoming policies and decisions and changes to how we operate, things like that. But there's also the opportunity for external scrutiny, so you can look at outside bodies, you can look at those wider community issues. I was hearing the rural transport. I also heard very loudly about broadband provision. I thought that could be a very good topic for the Overview and Scrutiny Committee. And then you have your response role, which is very much individualised for each council. So those are things like the call-ins or the petitions review that we had in Babergh in the last municipal year, which none of us had come across before. And obviously, as you say, we were developing the protocol for that as we went. So I think there's probably 2 sessions outside of a formal meeting that could be very beneficial: bespoke training and then a session around developing your work programme. Thank you, Chair.
Could the recommendation then be that a bespoke training programme be prepared forthwith for implementation as early as possible? Councillor Grandon, I'll come back to Councillor Caston. Councillor Caston, I did see your hand, but is this on the same subject as Councillor McLaren?
Yeah,
I thought it might be. Would you mind if I come back to you, Councillor Caston?
No,
that's fine, thank you. Councillor McLaren and then Councillor Grandon.
Yes, I think bespoke I want it to embrace all the possible aspects of overview and scrutiny. If that is possible for a recommendation.
But bespoke would seem to fit the bill there, but you don't like it. As opposed to off the peg is what I meant, you know, something tailor-made.
I understand that. And perhaps some recognition of what committee members themselves feel they need. So we're actually making a judgment here, but I guarantee that round this committee there will be different areas that worry committee members would like
Are we getting the cart before the horse if we ask the committee members to advise
No,
officers?
no, what I'm saying is I want the training programme to recognise that there will be different needs for different people. Okay.
Can we find a form of words for recommendation 3 on training that you'll be happy with? Councillor Grandon, you might have a suggestion there.
No, I haven't, but I just wanted, sorry, I only wanted to simply say that could this training be sort of more of a, or part of it be, have a workshop element so that it's kind of interactive rather than us being, all of it being us being trained, but there's also an interactive element so that...
I think it can be whatever we want it to be,
Great.
effectively.
Okay.
There's a lot of resources available, and we know we have the officers who've got the knowledge, and we also know that whatever the ECF Centre for Public Scrutiny is now called, also have a lot of information that we can use, and courses, and individual members are able to go on outside courses. I've been down to London more than once, so has Keith. We got lost. Big city, you know, really, really big place. Anyway, putting that aside, Emily.
Thank you, Chair. I've just typed out a form of words and I would just like to put that to the committee. So the recommendation would be to hold a bespoke training session for committee members encompassing all elements of the scrutiny function and taking into account the skills and experience of individual members. And what we could do, Chair, is before the session is do a bit of a skills audit, so just send around a questionnaire so that can feed in to the trainer who's delivering the session.
And the purpose of that session would be to produce said programme. I mean, that should be the point, surely, because the session should not be a dead end. It should be a starting point to produce the programme that I believe you want, Councillor McLaren. Is that correct?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Emily. I couldn't have put it better myself.
So, Henriette, can you get that into... Yes, okay. I can...
I think what we have in the voting is that it is the recommendation is read by the committee clerk.
That's how we'll do it then. Right, any other further recommendations? I think... Sorry, Councillor Caston, you were next.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm not sure how you'd put this into a recommendation, but on the scrutiny committee, I would like to see more witnesses from maybe the different levels, because we have very good witnesses from Mid-Suffolk. For instance, to help explain, like if we're looking at homelessness, an expert witness, an outreach worker, or that kind of thing, that, you know, with the remit to tell us things exactly how they are as they see them, and complete free rein to say how they feel about things, and like also tenants and use people like that. I know it's been quite difficult to get people to come forward because everyone's very busy, and it has been difficult to get people engaged, but I think that would be really useful for this committee. We have fantastic reports, but if we peel back another layer and look into that, that would make it really useful for recommendations to Cabinet, just to get a bit more experience in that way. And also, I don't think there's anything to stop members of the Scrutiny Committee going out with, well, obviously at the moment there is, but in the normal world, going out maybe with outreach workers or something in preparation for a scrutiny meeting to actually see what it's like on the ground. Yeah, not quite sure how that is a recommendation, but that's along the lines that I was thinking.
You'd be suggesting an increased use of a wider range of witnesses. Would that be the fair way of placing it? Okay, so if you'd like to recommend that, do we have a seconder for that one? Councillor Muller again, right, fine. So there's 4 now. We've got the pre-meetings. What was the second one, Emily? Henriette? Sorry.
So we have 4 recommendations. I do need to just catch Councillor Caston's recommendation a second. The first one is that pre-meetings of half an hour are adopted as a standard practice, and that was proposed by Councillor Caston and Councillor Muller. The second recommendation recommends that officer work on a proposal for increasing the size of each committee to 8 members to enable robust scrutiny for the sovereign committees.
My suggestion was 7 or 8, but they should be examined, basically. It doesn't have to be those specific numbers.
So to increase the size of each committee.
Yeah.
We'll just take the members up.
I think that's keep it open just in case.
It's fine. The third recommendation is to hold a bespoke training session for committee members encompassing all elements of the scrutiny function and taking into account the skills and experience of individual members. And the final recommendation was there was inclusion of Chair.
Increased use of a wider range of witnesses. Sorry, increased use of a wider range of witnesses. Would that cover all bets? Yes, Councillor?
I believe Councillor Caston also mentioned about externalising the meetings with witnesses to actually go into, for councillors to go and see how things are outside of a meeting rather than that. So I don't know how that would be worded into recommendations.
Subject, I suppose, to governance arrangements, because at some places we would not be appropriately going, but yes, I don't see why that... But that's possible anyway, yes. Effectively. It doesn't need a resolution or a recommendation. That is a matter of the personal will of any councillor to make contact with a group and say, look, can I come and see you? We don't need a recommendation to act as what we're elected to do, you know? So I think that's probably... I don't see a point in the recommendation, to be honest with you. I don't think it adds value. However, I do think it's a good idea. Well, let's keep the recommendation to the increased use of a wider range of internal and external witnesses, and then we've covered all the bets around there. Something we've referred to earlier on in the meeting was that the committees be prepared to consider the use of task and finish groups on individual projects to enable them to undertake a wider range of subjects. And I would give, for example, your transport issue with task and finish group to look at the issues and then to decide whether they can make recommendations to both committees as to how to take it forward on a wider scale. It is a big question, I believe. You think you'll have to agree with that. But a task and finish group from Overview and Scrutiny might be a good starting point. And a number of members, maybe 2 from each council, could be involved in setting that up. So I'd just like to suggest that an increase of use of task and finish groups of these committees as a recommendation, and I'd happily propose that if I can find a seconder. Councillor Epignon. Okay, that's fine. So there we have 5 recommendations. Does anybody want to add any others? Okay, so those 5 recommendations would be carried forward, and we'll be voting on those individually. Final one I'm proposing, and seconded by Councillor Epignon. We're missing what?
So we still need a proposing seconder for the third recommendation to hold a bespoke training session for committee members.
Councillor McLaren proposing, and I believe it was Councillor Grandin seconding, as I recall.
And fourth recommendation recommends that increased use of a wider range of internal and external witnesses be adopted by the committee.
Councillors Caston and Muller.
Sorry.
Is that okay? Yep, got that. It's fine. So we have proposers and seconders for 5 recommendations. We can, if you wish, members, vote upon those all en bloc, 1 to 5. I believe that's perfectly okay in governance procedures. So that's what I propose we do. All 5 of those recommendations to be made to wherever they should be made to. So if the voting is open.
Yes, Chair, the voting is now in progress. If you go to your modern.gov app for the agenda and press the plus sign at the top, scroll down the agenda, the blue line indicates the vote in progress.
Apologies, I can't currently reach it. I'm voting in favour of all.
Okay. Thanks very much, Councillor Carter.
But
And Councillor Muller? Also with favour.
Sorry, Chair, that is unanimous.
Thank you very much, members. That's unanimous. And we'll now move on then to item 8, the forthcoming decision list. Do members have any comments on the current forthcoming decision list? This is for noting only. And then items 9 and 10 are the Babergh and Mid-Suffolk Overview and Scrutiny Work Plans. A good point at which to make suggestions for noting for the chairs to consider as they go through. As you will see, these are Appendix A. I'm looking at the Mid-Suffolk one at the moment, so you can see that our review today is in there. In June, we have the CIFCO business plan and some information on public realm. In July, the annual review of the Joint Homes and Housing Strategy and Homelessness and Rough Sleeping Reduction Strategy, and a customer service update. There are gaps from August onwards, which obviously will be filled in the course of the year. But if any members have any ideas right now, we can note them for future reference, and they can be brought towards for the chairs to consider.
Chair, is this just for Babergh?
I think we can do it for both councils, and I believe we should, okay? We just note which one is for which, and if it applies to both councils, then we can apply it to both councils. It's up to the chairs to work that out.
Thank you, Chair. I've got two suggestions to look at. One is that we look at, I'm not quite sure how to word it, either delivery of services to the rural areas or rural transport. I think the former would take in a lot more, that would be a lot more work. So I think that's something for us perhaps to talk with officers about. We don't want to give them such a broad topic that we gain nothing from it. So that would be one. And the other is a scrutiny of the infrastructure delivery plan.
Yep. Chair. Okay, fine. So those could be added on to the potential subjects for the link. Councillor Carter, you have a suggestion?
Thank you for turning my mic on, whoever did that. I'd suggest, whilst looking at rural transport, to include as well accessibility and interconnectivity. Not everyone's going to want to get a train or a bus, but to be able to walk from one town to another, or to be able to cycle or use a wheelchair to get another place. It's all interconnected. So if we could look at thank you.
Interconnectivity. I think, I mean, when this is scoped, and I suspect it will have to be scoped, I think the size of the scoping will just show what a large and huge subject it is. I recall, I can't remember who it was made joined up transport SAR many years ago in a government, and nothing really came of it. They've always talked about integrating transport, but we'll see if anything comes of it. But I think it's got to be done on a local basis first. Councillor Wellham and then Councillor Scarf.
Chair, I think we perhaps ought to drop the word rural, because what Councillor Carter said reminds me that there are also problems travelling in and around Stowmarket, and there possibly is similar problems.
Well, I mean, some people would regard Stowmarket as rural, but I think this is the problem. I was being cheeky, nothing more than that, all right? Effectively, what it is it's our districts that matter here, and regardless of what we call the communities, they are our communities, so not a problem. Councillor Grandon. Oh, sorry, Councillor Scarf, you're next. I'll come back to you, Councillor Grandon.
Thank you, Chair. One item that's on both of our lists is the underspend of grants for bringing empty homes back into use. Now, we did look at that in March, and we determined, whilst we were in the emergency response, senior leadership team deemed this was not a high priority, I wonder if we can have another look at that again, because housing is an ongoing issue, as we all know, and actually the urgency of ensuring that empty homes are back into use is more pressing now than ever before, particularly with the fact that during the pandemic, tenants have had considerable protection from the government in terms of not being able to be evicted, etc. But I think it's going to become a very live issue, and therefore any empty homes that could be put to good use, I think, you know, that should be further up the agenda now.
Yep, I think that's about to become a hot topic in both councils, is it not? I recall there's some work due to come forward in the next few months. I could be wrong. Am I right, Kathy? Bringing empty homes back into use, underspend of the grants. Because of the COVID situation, this was sort of put on a back burner. It was, SLT deemed it not to be a high priority in the emergency, but I believe that we're hopefully coming to the end of the emergency.
There's certainly work ongoing in that, and it would be an area that you could add to your list for consideration this year, but with the benefit of further input from Gavin Fisk.
Well, I saw some figures recently about the number of homes that were not in use recently, and I concur with you there. Anybody else? Yes, Councillor Grandon, I apologise. I'm back to you now.
That's right, Chairman. Thank you. I really should know this, so please forgive me, but when it comes to examining something like transport, which is a county issue, what are we expecting to come out of it? And will we be perhaps bringing the transport people from county in as our witnesses? And how, I know that's going to be for the scoping nearer the time, but I'm just wondering, as this isn't a district issue, what are we hoping to achieve?
We are able to do so. We can call for witnesses from County Council, and indeed we can call witnesses from a bus company if we want to. We can call witnesses from all sorts of places if we want to. Some of them we can actually summons if we want to, can't we? I'm not sure if we ever summons anybody, but you know, we can sort of, we have powers. Councillor Scarf.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I'm just going to give an example, actually, particularly on rural transport. When I was previously a member of the District Council some years ago, when scrutiny started as a process, in fact, very new to the process, we actually called in the County Council when they changed the number of subsidies to public bus services, and we actually had expert witnesses as well who were directly affected by those changes in the services. So we actually conducted a review, and I think this must be 10, 12 years ago. So we've done it before, and there's absolutely no reason. There was a natural reticence at that time by the other authorities to come and present to us, but we reminded them that they actually have a duty to do so, because if it affects either of these two councils' residents, we can review it exactly how you said. So I think we should do it, most definitely.
On the Citizens Advice Bureau Task and Finish group, we had a full range of witnesses from Suffolk, Ipswich and all authorities involved. So yes, all possible. It just needs the will. Okay, well I think we've added enough to the work plan for the moment. Councillor Caston, you have something to add?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I did wonder if with this census that's recently been completed, whether that's something that we should be looking in the, because this goes quite a long way into next year, whether that's something that we need to look at, the comparison, how Mid-Suffolk and Babergh are changing.
I'm not sure when the results are due, but I have a strong suspicion it's not going to be 2022. Is it? It's going to be 2022? They'll be out. Within a year. Okay.
But, well, that might be one for the future then.
I think so. And
we
actually,
go to March 22 here.
And obviously, the effect of any census is, well, it's basically a massive snapshot of your demographics, and you're not going to get a better one, really, are you? Nah, okay. Councillor Grandin.
I don't know if it's possible to examine this, but I was wondering whether we're allowed or able to look at the way the cabinet or cabinets are operating and see whether it's working for the whole of the council.
Emily, can you answer? This is a sort of governance question, I suspect, and of course the decision about the cabinet system is something that's
whether some of the details of it are working, you know, whether it's working communications-wise and the way it kind of operates as a practical, you know, in a practical way for the whole of council. Are we learning information we need, or are certain aspects of it working for them and for us? You know, is that something we're able to scrutinise?
Yes, Chair, if through you, if I can answer that. Yeah, absolutely. One of the primary functions of the Overview and Scrutiny Committee is to hold the Cabinet to account and to look at the way that the Cabinet functions, and that doesn't need to be restricted solely to looking at the decisions that have been made by the Cabinet. You can also look at the wider context in which the Cabinet operates. So are individual portfolio holders effectively working within their portfolio? Are they communicating the key aspects of that portfolio? Is the Cabinet meeting itself open enough? Is there enough transparency? All of those aspects. So not just actually the outcomes from the activity of the Cabinet, but actually how it operates in itself is within the scope of the committee.
One thing we've always stressed since we instituted the cabinet system at Babergh and at Mid Suffolk is that the relationship between council, cabinet and scrutiny, and the three sort of legs on which the council operates, and if they don't communicate with each other, that's a problem. So yes, fine, good point. Kath? Yeah, go on.
Sorry, may I make another suggestion then, please? That we look at doing that, but then maybe make it more than one meeting, so that we look at one aspect of it, or certain aspects of it in one meeting. But I think it's almost like a too big topic, and that maybe another set of aspects in another meeting.
Would it be something to scope and then to follow up with? I think that's
so.
what you're describing here sounds to me like a scoping process.
I think probably, yes.
And then that would give officers a lead in, and then you could take it from the scoping coverage and how you wish to go further and drill down to, because I suspect you won't change everything in every single aspect of a big subject like that. But if you get some bits of it right, then the rest may follow.
But it is a big subject, as you say, so I think we may find that it may require more than one meeting to tackle it and to do it well enough.
I certainly will.
But I think it perhaps ought to be something that we should do earlier rather than later, because it's going to take a while, or at least to look at earlier rather than, because it's going to take a while, and then we would hope to see the results of any meeting within this term, rather than push it to the long grass, or it all take too long for it to for the effects to be seen in our time in this term. So may I suggest that becomes a priority, perhaps, if everyone agrees.
Sorry, from what you're saying then, I mean, looking at that in terms of the spaces in the work plans, I've got the Mid Suffolk one there, but I think the Babergh one is going to be very similar. August would be the earliest in the sort of gap in the calendar. I mean, I'm just suggesting, well, July is taken up, 15th of July. August is the earliest opportunity, and then there's September. Emily?
Chair, just in terms of timetabling, I think it would be useful to give yourselves a bit longer just to think about the format of that review, and particularly because I think this is a very good opportunity for scrutiny to co-design the review with members of the Cabinet, because of course that is something that you can do, is you can look at those issues together. And the Cabinet themselves will of course be reflecting on their operation, the way they work, the way they interact with other councillors, and I'm sure they have some suggestions that they'd like the committee to look into as well. So I think giving it a bit longer in terms of your programme actually enables you to have those conversations with the leaders and other members of the Cabinet when you're forming the scope of the review.
Off the cuff, I would say that it should be a collaborative process if it's to be of any use, so that it shouldn't be adversarial between scrutiny and cabinet. It should be cooperative and beneficial, and obviously beneficial to the whole of the council. That would be the principle that you'd want to run on, I hope. So that can be added to the work plan. Councillor McLaren.
Presumably we are talking about individual groups. This is not a joint.
I guess you would have to say that it would be Mid-Suffolk and doing it in one group and Babergh in another, possibly.
They're not, because they are dissimilar.
They are dissimilar cabinets and the dissimilar makeups operating in. Does that be a perfectly reasonable? Would it not? So this it's quite possible that the two separate councils could examine scrutinise that aspect separately, and should probably work with their own cabinets. Mm-hmm. We know there are differences, so let's embrace that and work with it. Okay. Any more items that people wish to add to the work plans? Henriette? Oh, sorry. Kathy?
Just reflecting on the fact that we are hopefully coming out of a pandemic, and thinking about what the key issues and impacts on our communities are as a result of that. I'm just thinking about those areas like mental health, skills, debt, and those would again be very much themes in the, if you like, the system theme. How are the system of partners working effectively to address those sort of increased impacts on communities?
Seems a little obvious that we none of us thought of mentioning the COVID, the coming out of the pandemic and the recovery process. Obviously, it's going to be a topic on everybody's minds, so that might be something that definitely, I think it'll still be a little while before we'll get true clarity in and facts and figures, but I think it's got to be added to the list. Councillor Carter?
Thank you again, who is doing that for me. I did wonder, whilst scrutinising of cabinet, would it not be beneficial if we scrutinised each other's cabinet? Because whilst we are scrutinising our own cabinet, there might be political bias, there might be some within it might make it difficult. And if you're looking at another outside and you're looking from an external point, would that not be beneficial to have an outside perspective as well as an internal perspective?
I can foresee governance issues with that, but what do other members think, and particularly what does Emily think?
Thank you, Chair. So you would have to vote on any recommendations separately, because obviously this is a sovereign council issue. It's about how the cabinet for that particular council functions. But there is no restriction on you having perhaps some of those early parts of that discussion and that review together, recognising, as members have said today, the benefits of having more voices in the room and a greater depth of experience. So you'd need to take any recommendations separately, but the work in the lead up to that could be done jointly.
You'd be establishing general principles, but perhaps applying them differently in terms of decisions made by, or recommendations made by each separate committee, I think is how you handle that. But it is an interesting one. Thank you very much. That's the sort of meat and drink to Emily, isn't it? But I like it. Right, sorry. I'm getting off the point. Shall we move on? I think we've got everything we can add at the moment. We've got COVID in there. Does anybody have anything they want to add before we, well, conclude the meeting effectively? Thanks to everybody for coming today. Reasonable amount of time. We've got through a lot of ground. I don't think we'd have done it as quickly otherwise. The next joint Overview and Scrutiny Committee meeting will be on Monday the 28th of June at 9:30 a.m. I would recommend that I would hope that there will be a pre-meeting at 9 o'clock, but of course that's entirely up to the chairs. Can I thank everybody today, and good luck at the Mid-Suffolk Annual Council tonight and the Babergh Annual Council tomorrow night.